أهلا وسهلا بكم في حلقة جديدة من بودكاست منور، حيث نسير من عالم الصور العابرة والكلام المسطح إلى عالم أنجع وأكمل وأجدر، مع ضيوف كضيفنا الليلة طارق العليمي. طارق متخصص في مجال البيئة، والليلة سنسير معه في هذا المجال لنعرف ونتعلم أكثر. ستكون هذه الحلقة باللغة الإنجليزية. Welcome to Minwar Podcast. In this episode of Minwar Podcast, we're joined by Tariq Al-Olaimy, a social entrepreneur, environmentalist, and biomimicry specialist. Tariq's journey through his work with his firm 3BL Associates, building people-planet strategies, and his leadership on UNESCO's Global Action Programme on Education for Sustainable Development make this conversation an opportune one that is timely considering the coronavirus situation, or crisis rather. Simply we ask, what happened? Where did we go wrong? At a time where Mother Earth speaks to us and tells us enough is enough. Mother Earth has asked us to step back. She warned, yet we did not heed her calls. It appears her patience ran thin. Her patience ran out. And yet again we ask, how did we get here? Global leadership, scientists, thinkers, how could this not be foreseen? Or was it? And yet again we ask, how did we get here? But also, let's also explore how we can move forward. What does the future look like? And now, without further ado, Tariq, thank you very much for accepting this invitation and joining us for this conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. I must confess it's a little bit strange. I've been looking at Zoom boxes for the past few months and speaking to people digitally, so it's nice to have an in-person conversation where you can feel some energy exchange as well.
Well, I'm glad that you're finding this to be, that way, the energy and all that, because honestly, I think one thing that we're very interested in nowadays is not just kind of having deep conversations, but having deep conversations about things that are of our time, that are happening right now. And the coronavirus situation has really kind of changed many conversations, many things that I think scientists for many, many years kind of warned about, possibly. And, people never listened. And I think economies were kind of running on their own. I think today what we're finding is that we're kind of forced to kind of step back, and things that were not possible in the past have now become a must.
Absolutely. We're becoming more conscious about the systems that we've built, the world that they've created, the humanity that it's also created as a result of the systems, and really brought to light, I think, what needs to be changed.
Okay. So Tariq, let's begin here. When we talk about the environment, biomimicry, can you better define what we mean with the environment, ecology, biomimicry? What is this world, and what do these worlds and words mean?
I would start with in terms of the human view of the environment. One, it is starting with the recognition that humans are one of millions of species on the earth, that we participate in this system which we call life, that in being one of those species, it is our responsibility to both nurture our environment, to, as other scientists say in biomimicry terms, create conditions that are conducive to life, that we're actually participating in the system that brought life to us in the first place, that has nourished us, which has enabled us to build our societies, that we're not just taking from the environment, but actually we're recognizing we are nature. When we say the earth is in pain, the earth is also in pain because humans are in pain. We are part of that earth. We participate in that system, and we have a choice of, in terms of biomimicry, whether we learn from the lessons of the many ancestors that passed all these old fossils, all these species that no longer are with us because they made choices and they lived in a way which were maybe not cooperative. They maybe lived in a way which didn't give back as well to the earth, because we find that the species that are far more cooperative and collaborative, that have actually nourished and provide also these conditions, not only for life of their particular species, but the wider earth community, those are the species that are successful. So when we talk about sort of that framing of the environment, I think there's often that dissonance where there is that separation. And I think the biggest and the largest work we can do is to see ourselves as part of this system. And I think many solutions come from that place when we talk about sort of environmental or ecology work.
Okay, interesting. So I think what you're kind of saying is that there's no people and environment. Yes, at one level there is, but it's really, we are of the environment.
Exactly.
Interesting. So let's talk about biomimicry. What do we mean when we talk about biomimicry more specifically?
So to maybe sort of break it down, so biomimicry, bio means life, mimicry comes from mimesis, to emulate, and it is the conscious emulation of life's genius. It is a science and philosophy that looks at life and says that there has been 3.8 billion years of research and development. Life has figured out what works and what doesn't. Yes, in the human world, we have incredible art, we have incredible architecture, engineering, chemistry, physics. But actually, the greatest physicists, the greatest chemists, the greatest engineers are in the natural world. They've had far longer to figure out what works. And we can learn a lot from these elders, these other species. We can learn a lot from the patterns, the technologies, the systems that they've created. And we can learn and emulate those systems, whether it's through form, whether it's through function, to bring that into human society. That's sort of on one level. On another level, it does speak to something a little bit deeper, that when we're creating, for example, our cities, are we able to say that, and if you look at Ras Sanad and the mangroves there, are we able to say that the cities we're building and creating are as regenerative, that they provide as much back to the wider environment and to wider ecosystems as the mangrove forest next door? And it's basically to say that if nature has figured out in these rough desert conditions, how to be sustainable, how to be regenerative, how to flourish, it is possible within the realms of physics, chemistry, engineering on some level. Very, very difficult, of course. But it's also setting the standard for what we mean about sustainability, which goes far beyond some of the corporate definitions what we look at.
Can you go more into like what are the corporate definitions versus your view of sustainability?
So, well, often when it comes to corporate definitions, I mean, and when we talk about sustainability, it's often looking at, okay, we want to, in a business or a corporate sense, ensure that the development of today does not sacrifice the development of maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 generations ahead, looking at sort of future generations. This is not a new concept. Many indigenous communities have sort of thought the same. Some communities look at if you make a decision and it negatively impacts a community in the future, 7 generations after you, then you shouldn't take that decision. But actually, when you look at nature, we're talking about millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years of not only sustainability, not only saying that we're doing less harm, we're essentially saying that we're net positive. We're actually giving back to the environment. We're nourishing the soil. We're nourishing our ecosystems. We're not just taking from them, and we're not just offsetting, so to speak. And I think sort of the deeper aspect of biomimicry, and something that also connected me to it, was that it's so linked to the tasawwuf traditions, the mystic traditions as well out there. We come from a region and a land which many Sufi traditions speak to reading nature as if it's scripture. Maulana Rumi used to talk about the beauty of the beloved, the beauty of nature, the beauty of this universe is the ultimate classroom, the teacher, the lesson, and the book. We grew up on these stories, and it's beautiful metaphors and it's beautiful poems, but also for me, biomimicry is a way to make that real, to bring that to life and really to live it and embody it each day.
Okay, very nice, very nice. So when we talk about kind of the environment and us being one, where do you think we went wrong in terms of kind of the crises that compounded to where we are today? By that I mean, there's talk of, or there was talk, now it's all about coronavirus, but there's talk of global warming, there's talk of us kind of polluting our seas, our air, which relates to obviously global warming as well, and kind of all this pain that we're inflicting on Earth. I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, what are some of those pains and what are their dimensions? But then what are some of the human pains also that relate to that?
I think this time and this moment is bringing up, as it did before, and it's just accelerated now, a lot of introspection around the systems that we've built. There's been a lot of talk about sort of humans being the virus, and a lot of those sort of eco-fascist kind of views, which have come up very, very worryingly in certain spaces and in other spaces, and more quite rightly going deeper into some of the root causes. One of the fascinating things, and you brought up the issue of global warming, is many saying that, okay, we're not going outside, we're not participating in the economy, so that means this is good for nature. What's interesting about that is if you look at the emissions predicted reductions for this year, on average, it's about a 5 to 6% emissions reduction compared to last year. That's quite staggering, because that means where is the other 95% coming from?
Yeah, it's not much.
We've absolutely stopped our economies. We've supposedly taken a step back. Humans have gone in home. Yet, despite all of that individual action, the system that we've built is still as polluting and as destructive. And it will still run, and that is what capitalism does. And this is the system that we've created around ourselves. And I think I have a lot of compassion first, and I think our human communities, of the effect that has had, I think, on us. These conversations of late have really brought up the issues of inequalities. There's stats, I think, day on day about how the 8 richest people in the world are just getting richer, counterbalanced to the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are losing their jobs each and every single week. And you wonder why we tolerate the system, why we accept the system, why we are still adamant in so many cases of going back to normal when the normal didn't suit us. So I think this is really in many cases, the apocalyptic moment, apocalypse in the sense of the original root of the world, of the uncovering moment, I think for many systems. I think it's a choice that humanity does face of, do we really fundamentally change and shift our systems, because we indeed have many more crises to come, such as climate change, such as other pandemics, or do we lose this moment? Do we let this moment slip by and go further and deeper into what this crisis is, unfortunately accelerating ourselves into, which is even more deeper inequality?
So I think the question that I kind of always think about, especially like when we reflect on kind of your experience with UNESCO, the UN, I think Davos, summits that bring world leaders, corporate leaders, leaders of all kinds. The question that comes to mind is, well, one, I mean, you talk so openly about kind of the system that we've built and kind of capital, so to speak, and how it exploits, right? And how even with everything that's happening, we find ourselves with only a 5 to 6%, very modest, kind of reduction in emissions. We also find ourselves with the rich getting richer kind of situation. The question that comes to mind is, do world leaders think about these things? What happens behind those kind of closed doors, or maybe they're open? I don't know, at least not that I can see. Yeah. What is happening? What are those conversations? And two, is there an alternative?
This is something I think about a lot. And I think even more frustratingly, these conversations, whether behind closed doors, whether in more open doors, happen. These are discussed. The frustrating thing is that it stays in the room. There isn't the immediate translation into action, whether that's on the corporate level, whether that's on the public sector level. And I think for many, many reasons. For large companies, it is hard for them to shift. There's definitely many, and especially I think in the last year, who have taken pledges and commitments, and actually very, very deep commitments for transformational change. You mentioned Davos, and there's that shift from sort of shareholder capitalism to a more stakeholder capitalism, and looking at the wider aspect of what stakeholder means, and looking at a business shouldn't just serve the profits of its shareholders, but really the wealth of wider society. So that's both in the human rights, that's in supply chains, that's for communities, NGOs, etc. But often when I think companies are making these commitments, they don't realize actually how radical they are, what it really means to take us there. And whether they're set up as public companies and it's more difficult for them to shift, whether that's the conscious leadership is just not present there to lead them through it, or whether you have a conscious leadership and you have so many conflicting interests in politics that don't allow you to get there. And whether it's on a government level where you have world leaders who very openly speak about these issues, who are aware, but because of election cycles, because of the way their democracies or non-democracies are structured, they feel they can't get societies to move at least as fast as we would like them to do. So there's many, many reasons, I think, that are put on the table. But for me, I think the frustrating thing is there's been a lack of accountability. When world leaders, when private sector leaders come to the table, sometimes co-opting the language of social justice, sometimes using these wonderful words and phrases, but not really with a committed action, I think, to take it forwards. I'm seeing that slowly shift. Even sort of this year at Davos, you did notice actually a little bit more accountability, where when you're sitting down on the table, and some of these are also public sessions, and private sector leaders are making commitments, you actually have others in the room really telling them and holding them accountable in a way that I think didn't used to happen before. So there's definitely a shift. You're definitely seeing that consciousness move. But also, unfortunately as well, due to the pandemic, there's a lot of concerns whether are we stepping back 2, 3, 4, 5 years, if not even more, because of all of the progress that was trying to be made, and whether we'll just revert back to type that when economies open, we just want even more growth to make up for the growth that is lost. So I think now is a real test of commitment, of action, of courageous leadership, of whether we still truly believe in that world that world leaders have come, private sector leaders have come to promise and to commit to. No more so, of course, than also the Paris Agreement on climate change. And this was the year that we were meant to ramp up our commitments to climate change, that governments were meant to come to the table and say that at the moment, the trajectory we're at is a level of warming which would be so destructive, especially to Middle Eastern countries. And whether we come together to the table to respect all of human life, and that we will take the actions and commitments to do so, and that we'll also do that in parallel with respecting all of life and all of biodiversity on Earth, because when we look at all of biodiversity, we're also helping human beings.
Now, let me ask you this. Can you give us a better description of what it is that we're actually doing? What kind of pain are we inflicting on Earth? And what does that mean? Especially when you said the impact of that on countries in the region, in the Middle East. So one, what is the world doing? Mm-hmm. What kind of pain are we inflicting?
Yeah.
And two, how is that hitting us back?
It's sometimes hard to throw out numbers because the numbers can never do justice
or scenarios
to the devastation really that's been caused. You look at even in my lifetime of approximately 70% in some cases of biodiversity in this region and the world has been lost.
70%.
70%.
Wow.
Even in Bahrain, there's a lot of varying stats. Some of them are also around that mark for Bahrain, like since I've been born, of our biodiversity loss. For me, that genocide of nature, not only in what we see in the outwards of the mammals and species that maybe we're aware of, but it's also a genocide when it comes to the 6 inches of topsoil and the microbial kingdoms, essentially, that have sustained all of life. It is complete and utter destruction on every single level of a life system that, one, allowed humans to come to this earth and flourish, and is a destruction of that and of so many other species and families of other species and communities that are also non-human in this world. And I don't, and I'm not eloquent enough to find the words to ever be able to fully capture, I think, that devastation. What that translates to in human terms is we currently have a level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere which is higher now today than has ever been at any point of human existence. Humans did not develop and did not come to create our communities and societies in these conditions ever. When we talk about the Middle East in particular, it's one of the most highest impacted regions. And just to give you a sense of sort of best case scenarios versus worst case scenarios, under the Paris Climate Agreement, there's a goal of trying to keep sort of level of warming to 2 degrees Celsius, sort of set at the baseline of pre-industrial levels. Now, even at that 2 degrees, that would still mean islands are lost, countries are destroyed, communities need to be relocated. And when you look at the Middle East, we're already at 2 degrees. We've hit 2 degrees warming already. That worst case scenario for so many other sort of countries and situations is where we're already at in terms of warming. And at the same rate, if nothing else is done in terms of wider commitments, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, we are set for warming which is anywhere between sort of 3 degrees to 4 degrees. Now, at that level and at the rate that we're going, that means that sort of wet bulb temperatures, so both sort of heat and humidity together, makes countries like Bahrain inhabitable by the year 2080. That's, if you have a child today which is being born, that is the reality in which they could potentially grow up into. We talked about faith, and I work with many faith communities when it comes to climate change, and particularly the global Muslim climate networks, which are terrified that even something like Hajj or Umrah would not be able to be something that we can still participate in, that we can make those pilgrimages, because the conditions that it would be in are just absolutely intolerable. That societies without some magic technology that comes along, which we cannot plan or base our lives or our senses on in hoping for. Without that kind of technological solution, it's a deep concern, because we are in an island, we are islanders. In our cases, we live on an island which in some scenarios in 50 years' time as well, you're talking about 25% of Bahrain's sort of landmass being lost to sea level rise, if not more.
So at least 25%.
And again, it changes each year with better data. It also depends on the worst case and the best case. And some best cases I've seen from the Supreme Council on the Environment in Bahrain, them putting stats around 10% by the year 2050 in some cases. And it is, and I say it's always very difficult with stats when I think more research needs to be done. And I put that with a caveat of sort of very specific country scenarios. But in terms of global scenarios and what we see, it is consistent with that. Even when it comes to economics, where with what is happening with COVID now is not even a comparison with the effects of climate change. There's many studies by universities looking at what the economic effects of climate change will be. And in the cases of Middle East countries, many of them predict actually the cost is 100% of GDP. And we aren't prepared for a world like that. We're not prepared also because if we were going to be prepared, we need to make decisions today about how we build our cities, how we protect our countries, how we consume, right. What is the basis of consumption, not to think that we can just sort of kick the can down the road and say, okay, we're going to address it later. This is also the time in this kind of crisis, we really need to keep this to the forefront of we're going to be in a level where investment is needed more than at any time in modern history to recover from COVID. And they need to be green investments. They need to be investments in biodiversity. They need to be investments in conservation and restoration. They need to be investments in sustainable cities. They need to be investments in the sectors of the future, which we know are not fossil fuel based sectors. So there's all these kind of thoughts, thoughts coming up. And yeah, I sort of go back to we face that choice, because in many cases the choices we've made already are hard to go back on. We're already locked in to a certain level of emissions, no matter what we do. We're already locked in. Even when I think about government contracts, when it comes to energy and fossil fuels, we're already locked in when we choose to build more highways. And just seek to expand the number of highways around the world instead of looking at sort of more sustainable and public transport. These are decisions that are being made today, which will affect future generations. But it's even more pressing that it's not even generations as a plural. We're really talking about now generation. It is this next generation coming, which will need to be dealing with that utter devastation if we don't do something. And we're the generation which are, it's like the boiling frog effect. We're slowly being boiled as we speak, and we can see that and we can realize that around as well.
I think the interesting about fossil fuels in the region, especially in the Gulf, is that in a way our economies depend on fossil fuels. Like, the price of oil determines what our kind of incomes are in some respects. But also, they seem to be the cause of devastation for us. Cities that are designed for primarily the car, around the individual, kind of riding in his car at his own pace, at his own time, at his own whatever. And in a way, I think when earlier you were talking about the system, the movie The Terminator came to my mind. It's like you build this thing, right? And it becomes so sacred that we sacrifice. Well, the Terminator scenario is not like that, but I'm kind of adding a bit of flavor into this. We kind of sacrifice ourselves for the system's sake, and then the system kind of takes over our lives. And we become, we fall victim to the system in a way, a system that we built. And it's funny because the Terminator has that apocalyptic kind of twist also. So I just wonder what that means.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And that's also the request that's being made in many countries. Even as we speak, I think the UK made their announcement that people should go back to work, technically speaking. The same is being sort of said about the US, and it's not that it's more safe. It's just that the system is willing to sacrifice these individuals, essentially. And I also just want to mention sort of a very important point regarding fossil fuels, and it's a tension that always comes up amongst climate activists as well in the region, because it's one, holding the acknowledgement that actually it's because of fossil fuels indeed brought rise to our development in the region. That can never be discounted. That from that, our education systems, health systems, etc., that the abundance, the affluence, that which we hold dear and which we love about our societies, also came as a result. And many of our either parents, families, all like worked in those industries as well. And it's the deep acknowledgement for the care that they put into it at the time, because they believed that's actually what was enabling development, and it did, and it got us far. But it's also the point of where we also need to transition and have a just transition, where those who are and have been involved in those industries, those who have been contributing to those sectors, that we're not casting them aside. It's not saying that they are the cause of the destruction of the earth as well when it comes to individuals, although I'd say that in some cases for many fossil fuel CEOs, I'll reserve that for them. But it's also stepping into that balance of that compassion, empathy, for that people also participated in that system, because what is available, what was required at the time, and also as far as we knew that would benefit our societies. It's just now we're called to make a different choice, especially in the Gulf.
Okay. So Tariq, I want to talk about some of the solutions that, I mean, we talked about a few, but going a bit more depth into some of the solutions that you see as a way forward for kind of, let's say, mitigating some of these upcoming crises.
Yeah.
What do you see?
Well, there's a lot of different discourses that are out there in terms of solutions. I think one, in looking at we talk about the system, and one, yes, looking at it also as a system of solutions, because when we talk about things like inequalities, when you talk about climate change, it's so linked to many other issues regarding whether it's gender issues and patriarchal issues and gender-based violence, whether that's on the deeper inequalities when it comes to colonialism and also indigenous communities. We're also looking at sort of wider issues when it comes to how we are designing our economies. So there's different movements, for example, that look at regenerative capitalism. It's less capitalism, actually. It's more sort of adding the term, but looking at what would it look like for our industries and our systems where it is not just where companies are taking resources, but that the resources that we're taking, we're also regenerating back, that we are looking at more circular models as well. We are looking at wealth in a different way, where it's not just defined as profit for a particular individual or company, but it's looking at the wider wealth of our well-being. It's looking at the wider wealth of the natural world. It's looking at the wider wealth also of our internal dimensions of our lives and what it means to participate and be part of these systems, and the wealth of all communities, in the case of things like stakeholder capitalism, rather than looking at one or two sort of specific shareholders. There's also other theories around donut economics, for example. I'd also highly recommend that as a book and a series if you go search that online, which is looking at what is our economic theory for building development in a way which is within our planetary boundaries. So that if we say that we have both planetary boundaries and societal boundaries, so we have boundaries of in regards to the pollution in the air that we can emit in the CO2. We have boundaries in terms of our use of nature and natural resources. We also have boundaries when it comes to human resources as well, and how much we can push human beings in our own well-beings. And you can sort of map out, okay, what are these planetary limits that we cannot exceed? And how do we then build within our economic theories of that? Our companies, our governments, our systems, our cities that work within those planetary boundaries. Every year there's, I think it's by WWF, if I'm not mistaken, where they have a World Overshoot Day, where they look at what is the point in the year in which we've already exceeded our planetary boundaries.
I see.
And it's always in the first half of the year. I'm not sure what it is going to be this year, or if it's already passed perhaps. But we need to make sure that we're not overshooting our planetary boundaries, and we have the economic theories around it as well. We have the stakeholder theories around it. We have a sense of what those industries need to be, whether it's in green jobs, industries, energy. We have technology which is getting us there. And in a lot of cases, it's then the willingness and the bravery to adopt these systems, the collaborative models that are needed to adopt these systems as well.
Tariq, what comes to mind also is, I think, as you're speaking, I'm thinking, talking to a quote-unquote capitalist, right? You tell them, oh, look, we're talking about limits and boundaries and kind of all these, notions that sound very reasonable. And the capitalist would get unhappy, would probably think how to kind of get around these limits.
Yep.
And I think that perhaps it is because our ideas of happiness, our ideas of well-being are wrong, are flawed, to use perhaps a milder term. It's that we've come to find our happiness in capital growth and not in something else. That the moment you talk about limits, it's like, oh, well, I guess I'm going to be less successful, less happy. And I think this goes back to some of the things that you're saying about the way you view the world through spiritual traditions, mystic traditions, tasawwuf, viewing the world as this kind of not us and the world, this and that, but rather kind of one complete and whole system or being or existence. And so what do we have to say to that? Like what are some of the wrong and flawed rather notions that need to kind of go away, and where should we move towards? How should we fix, if that's the right word, correct or reform, whatever word we can use there, the human spirit in that case?
Yeah.
What's needed?
There is a quote I use many times from Maulana Rumi, which just speaks to yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world, and today I'm wise, so I want to change myself.
Beautiful.
And even when we talk about things such as sort of capitalism, those beliefs, even in the well-being work that we do, what shows up a lot is the effect of internalizing capitalism, how deeply it is internalized within us.
Yes.
And we can see that also in very small things, and I'm definitely not immune to it as well. We can see that in the times we choose to overwork, the times we see it when we don't set our boundaries, when we're always on WhatsApp and feeling the constant need to be productive, that when we take rest, we feel guilty, that we are that reflection as well. I think of all that is happening to the world has also been things that have been happening, I think, within us. And when you talk about sort of that pain and devastation, those systems have also caused pain and devastation on human beings. We see the increasing stats around mental health and the mental health crises that is emerging. And it's both beautiful that there is greater awareness around it, but also frightening in that particular sort of pandemic. And I think where we start when we talk about also all those overlapping systems of oppression, whether it's sort of those more exploitative capitalistic models, whether it's the patriarchy or rather male supremacy, whether it's in some cases white supremacy, whether it's...
Or any sort of racial supremacy.
Yeah, or any... or whether it's the devastation and exploitation of resources or biodiversity, all of that, all that is happening there outside in the world is in some way also reflected back, I think, within us, both in the effect that it has on us, the effect of us participating in these systems without our full consent or without our full ability to go beyond that situation. The number of times you'll see here young people sort of hating their jobs or not really having also a passion for it, not feeling that their values align with their workplace, but really not feeling that they have another option in which to do so. And what actually that does to the human soul when you're in that space. And of course, and you're sort of speaking to the mystic traditions, there is, yes, that acknowledgement of not looking at these things as separate, that it is also whole, but also that to change that reality, we must change ourselves. When I speak to you here, I speak from a large sense of ignorance over the knowledge that I have is so minute. I'm sure many of the people listening to this would have so many points to add upon and what could be said better and what could be made more eloquent. And I recognize that ignorance. I I think also especially in the systems that we benefit from, I think also as men having this conversation, in the patriarchal societies that we live in, even if we may not agree with them, even if we may try to fight against them, we have been in so many cases beneficiaries of these systems. And how do we both hold those kinds of truths, whether it's that or whether it's any other system, and then both to undo that work and do that healing work inside that's needed, but also have that reflected in the work that we do outside.
As you speak, I recall one of our past conversations, and it's as if an alienation that we live within us, or that we feel within us, it's as if we're feeding that alienation with the material world, which is, okay, that solves a few physical problems, but it does not fix that alienation.
Yeah.
And instead of kind of going within and resolving that alienation, connecting with spirituality or kind of those real traditions that exist, what we're doing instead is, and I'm talking here like as a whole, right? What we're doing is we're kind of feeding that alienation with things that make us more thirsty. You know, we have that Arabic saying, it's like someone takes you to the sea and brings you back thirsty. Well, yes, because that will make you thirstier. Tariq, I'm interested, you mentioned something about work and people not being passionate about their work. How did you get involved in, because if I read this correctly, that this wasn't what you studied or what you went into, kind of, you kind of moved into your, you kind of moved into the world of ecology and environment and biomimicry, kind of, that happened after, there was a transition, right?
Yes.
What was that journey like? What happened?
So I think what you're referring to, I studied for my undergrad. It was investment and financial risk management. So
yippee!
So very much living the Bahraini dream of studying a finance degree, and this was in 2006.
Nice.
Very cliche. A lot of that was also born out of not knowing what to study, and I did have a love at the time for graphic design, actually, and was doing work in that when I was in high school, and it was either that or finance. I learned very early on that I took on a couple of clients in graphic design work, which I absolutely hated. And I learned very early on a distinction between not everything that I love doing, I actually want to turn into work. And that pushed me away and swayed me a little bit more towards the finance track and the risk track, because I was also interested in probabilities. I think risk is also an interesting discipline because it really touches upon what is your viewpoint on life and your conception on life and how you view the development of the world. And yeah, I think my interest in these issues really happened in university. I talk about sort of turning moments or moments of quote unquote radicalization, maybe. And it was definitely the point of the financial crisis in 2008. That for me was a very big turning point, because I was studying in London at the time. We were going into lectures every single day, learning about these risk models, in which my lecturers would come and say, listen, this model, which has said is going to predict this particular event once in every 100 years, has happened every single day for the last 2 weeks. We know it doesn't work, so we acknowledge that, but at the same time, we have nothing else to teach you. We have nothing else that's better. And you're going into university thinking, okay, I know what I'm learning is wrong. There's a value in that as well. But you see a system collapsing in front of you. You see the banks not too far from our university sort of closing down and shutting down. At the same time, there was a rising movement of climate action in London. There was a rising movement towards social entrepreneurship and corporate social responsibility as well in the city. On the way to my walk to university, I used to see climate activists do what they call die-ins. Sort of these are protest events where they sort of lie on the floor and they pretend that they're dead, to also symbolize, this destruction that we talked about of the future. And it's hard to separate yourself from that. It's hard to not think more introspectively about, is this really what I want to study? Is this something that I really enjoy? Is this something that really aligns with my values? And for so many of those questions, it was no. Also then feeling stuck and thinking, I feel committed to this because I also have to say this, and what enabled me to go into the field is the immense privilege I have. The immense privilege I have to have been able to have had a very good education in Bahrain, that I had a mother in particular who supported me in studying abroad, the responsibility as well of that privilege to use that for good, and also not to take a good few years to go kind of mid studies and say maybe I need another 4 years to study something completely different. So I did feel that weight of not feeling I wanted to shift completely. Instead, what I did is I got involved in wider society. I got involved in movements. I got involved in social enterprises. I got involved in youth organizations like ISIC, shout out to them, which really gave me a space to learn and to practice sort of these values, to be around individuals who cared about these issues as well. And it didn't actually start with the environment. It started with social development. It started with migration. It started with more wider sort of corporate social responsibility. And the environment came in because everything was linked to it. There's nothing that could be separated from it. And I felt that for me to be able to do better work when it comes to development, you needed to have some type of ecological literacy. You needed to have some basic fundamentals of how life works if you're really going to be sort of working towards solutions. So that was kind of the mental shift and the heart shift. And sort of moving back to Bahrain eventually, I was looking for a job as my sister at the time in the field around sort of social entrepreneurship and sustainability. We both couldn't find it in Bahrain. There wasn't a public space for it. There wasn't a private sector kind of organization for us to really be able to do our work. And we decided sort of quite simply to start it ourselves here. So that's kind of how it shifted there. And I made a very conscious choice then not to do a master's. For me, the education system as it wasn't working for me. I'm not an academic. You've had some wonderful academics on the show. I'm definitely not that. Struggled in that formal education system and very much embraced the philosophy of lifelong learning, whether it's in the short courses, alternative courses, certifications, but also stepping into other movements and work as a form of learning and having a learning plan in mind of what I really wanted to unpack both in myself and also really learn through and with community.
Nice. And then I think then kind of you and your sister started a firm, right?
Yes.
A company.
3BL Associates.
So how did that, following what you said, how did that kind of happen? Because you said there was no space for that. So I'm thinking sometimes like, okay, there is no quote unquote market for it. You kind of have to create it in a way.
Exactly.
How did that work out? How did that happen?
That was both our knowing and our concern at the time. This was a long journey. But yes, there wasn't a market, so to speak, but there was a need. And we saw a societal need. We saw societal need on... It wasn't just about, for us at the time, about specific social issues as much as it was, of course, addressing that. Of course, we knew sort of then about the issues around gender, around climate change, even around sort of human rights and supply chains, etc. For us, when we entered into it, I think our interest was more not just about solving the issue, but it was solving the way that social issues are solved. That we were addressing it from a way which, and this isn't just in Bahrain, this is really talking about in wider Middle East, but also in the wider discourse around the field of sustainability around the world, where it was very much in silo. We often, and we sort of started with this example in our work of things like diabetes, which was one of sort of the first topics we were looking at, and how even an issue like diabetes, where we have per capita one of the highest rates in the world in Bahrain, I think it's definitely top 20, if not top 10. but how that is so linked to climate change, because actually the increasing heat stress that's caused by climate change actually makes those who are suffering from diabetic retinopathy and neuropathy, for them to have more complications. That there's a link between the unsustainable food systems, the unsustainable transportation systems and sedentary lifestyles, and that impact back on the health and livelihoods of human beings, and how that also is a driver and accelerator for type 2 diabetes. How then a more carbon-intensive health system then goes back and feeds back into this sort of vicious cycle and loop of then more unsustainable sort of cities, more unsustainable systems as well, and how even on one sort of issue, you could just look at such an interconnected web of systems, let alone the gender violence that can happen and that's crossed between the two issues. Let alone the economic inequalities that are caused by issues like diabetes and the effects that it has in actually negating the progress that we've made on things like the Millennium and Sustainable Development Goals. So our focus when we started was really looking at how do we change the system in which we're solving issues. Biomimicry is one such sort of approach and learning approach, looking at things such as collective impact, and sort of others where we stepped into that. Of really looking at what are these frameworks we can adopt and implement and also create ourselves. And sort of our work around, for example, public-planet partnerships is also speaking to that, which is looking at what is a different framework for us to engage with nature as a partner and as a collaborator. So yeah, that's when we started, was very much that, and that thinking in mind. And we started as a consultancy. It was very much stepping into the role of educator, I think, very much so at the beginning, and still is. We learned that education was probably 80% of the work, which was interesting for us, and how we needed to do that work, whether it's on a corporate CEO level, whether it was on a civil society level, and at the same time acknowledge our knowledge was also limited, and try to be educated as well at the same time, and enter into that space. And yeah, that's how we kind of started.
What are some of the kind of solutions you've worked on? Because, I think about your specialization kind of in biomimicry and people-planet strategies that you guys put together. So can you give us a few examples of kind of few things that you worked on, kind of like real life things that you took from the environment, from mimicking life and putting it into a framework that people can work on?
So there's sort of two aspects of what we do. There is a consultancy, and then there's what we call a think-do tank. Mm-hmm. So these are our own kind of initiatives, our own social enterprises that we set up, usually also in collaboration with other organizations. So in terms of our own initiatives, there's a few, and I'll speak to the ones that are kind of running today. One is around that frame of public-planet partnerships. So that was actually coming from our work in biomimicry, because biomimicry speaks to how can we emulate nature. Mm-hmm. What we also wanted to do is, yes, how can we emulate nature, but also how can we collaborate with nature? Just in the same way that we think about a collaboration between a government or a private sector entity, between two enterprises together, we talk about it all the time in terms of public-private partnership. What does public-planet partnership look like? So we took much of what we knew, mixing both the consulting world, spiritual ecology, design thinking, to look at what is a framework we can develop to both educate governments, enterprises, scientists through a process and a framework, where at the end of it, they can think about, okay, what does it look like to actually have a collaboration with a colony of bees? Whether it's for data gathering, whether it's for regeneration of other purposes. What does it look like to have a partnership with pigeons to actually help monitor air pollution? What does it look like to have a partnership and a collaboration with frogs to help improve water quality? What does it look like, and sort of these are sort of examples of different case studies around the world. What does it look like to partner with vultures to help in your waste management strategy? And it's thinking about that on an individual level, but it's also thinking about that, as you said, on a wider level, about how are we building our systems to better include nature. So yes, we had that philosophy, but we wanted something a little bit more tangible. So for those who are interested, publicplanetpartnerships.com, you can sort of look at all our toolkits for free. A lot of that is made open source.
Beautiful.
We also have sort of our other work, which is on well-being. So I've sort of spoke a lot to well-being as well in this conversation, and the organization Recipes for Wellbeing, which is in collaboration with sort of two other entities, Akasha Innovation and Euphoria in Italy and Switzerland. And we started that together to really address the question of, yes, internalized capitalism, but also the burnout that many change makers, many young people, many individuals doing this work around social justice and activism feel in their work on their mental health, on their physical health, on their emotional health, and their spiritual health. And really, how do we build systems that care for the carers? So we tried to create that in a way which was one, opening up practices, well-being resources that used to be sort of very closed, and making that open to a wider community, translated into recipes, we sort of call them, to guide people through. And for any entrepreneur, for example, around the world to take that, or any social entrepreneur to take that and be able to really hold space for that conversation around well-being and wellness within their organizations, but also to do the inner work of untangling all the barriers and blockages within. We also have our work on diversity, so an initiative that we have called Diversity on Board, which is looking at mainstreaming diversity, starting with women in the Arab world on board positions, so corporate board positions, advisory board positions, NGO board positions. We have some of the lowest rates as well in the world for board positions in the MENA region for women. We have a huge economic gender gap, and part of that, and one part of the solution, not all of the solution, one small part of that solution is also making sure that the top level of management also better reflects diversity. And we have other initiatives that we've sort of started like that, also around things such as nonviolent resilience versus nonviolent resistance, which is sort of looking at all this passion around activism, and especially in the Arab world, which often has not a place to go. Models like social entrepreneurship can be very conducive and productive ways to channel people's energy, to look at not only the critique of the system, as much as that's very important and is essential, but also how then you participate in really the solutions that are needed to better the system in your societies and neighborhoods. So there's a lot that we sort of started on our own, in addition to the client work that we do.
How do you define social entrepreneurship? For those who are just listening, not watching, there's a smirk on his face.
It's there's a wider context, some of which I can't share on this,
right.
I think publicly. So I laugh because it's a conversation that's very active and present at the moment.
Okay, nice.
In the Gulf and also Bahrain, around what does that really mean? Because it's a spectrum, honestly, and it's difficult to define it with, I think, any one thing. And it's a spectrum that's looking at everything from sort of NGOs, which have maybe a revenue generating aspect to what they're doing, with a shop, etc.
But I mean, in essence, social entrepreneurship is like giving back.
Well,
so then we can go into the spectrum.
Okay, so I'll talk about it maybe more widely before I go into the micro. So essentially with social entrepreneurship, its very simple form is using an entrepreneurial method to solve social issues.
Okay, beautiful.
Now, there is a spectrum in what that means and how we understand the world maybe today in its models. Usually we think about it in terms of there's a charity and then there's a business. Social entrepreneurship is kind of there in the middle. It's looking at maybe some of the very same issues that charities are looking at, but then it's using the innovative models, the systems models, the efficiency, the productivity of maybe what business would go into, with the caveat of hopefully business for good and not the more exploitative models. So now sort of the spectrum, where really it can be anything from sort of an NGO, which is then taking the step to we look at adding sort of revenue generating models to what they're doing, so they're not just relying on charity. It could be hybrid models where they have a business and an NGO.
Like a waqf, I guess, in kind
exactly.
of our, that's one example. Yeah.
And it can be one sort of entity in and of itself that's also focused on solving a sort of social environmental issue. It could be a social business, which for those who are familiar with Muhammad Yunus, who's a Nobel Peace Prize winner and the founder of Grameen Bank, sort of alongside Sir Fazil Abed of BRAC, both of them very well known for coining and really making microfinance very popular. So in that sense...
which for those who don't know, it's basically giving kind of very small loans to, in fact, started in Bangladesh with a lot of women, I believe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sort of microloans to the poor, empowering them and also making them owners of, in many cases, the enterprises that they were also being invested into. So in that sense, it's really sort of solving that social issue, but also where all of the profits are reinvested back into the organization. There is no dividends which are given to any investors. It's only maybe up until the certain amount in which is being invested, but nothing more. And then you have, and this is kind of the newer language in the Gulf, impact enterprises. So these are usually the tech enterprises, the for-profits. Maybe they're doing ed tech, health tech, etc. Maybe they don't also have the social justice lens per se that maybe a social business would do, but they still kind of address a sort of a social issue. Now, sort of having said that across the spectrum and also around social entrepreneurship in general, there is a level of, and this goes back to why also 3BL started, about with many social entrepreneurs, they actually want to go out of business as opposed to an enterprise. And the reason they want to go out of business is because eventually they want to make sure that actually the reason why they exist, the social issue.
Right, problem solved.
Exactly, problem solved, and we move on. We're not building this model which is sort of constantly, which is not constantly being sort of used to having that issue exist.
You're not building the Terminator.
I really should go back and watch the Terminator again, because like the way that you're speaking about it, I was like, this is not how I remember it. But I need to go back and listen to this.
You probably had too much fun while watching it. That's probably it.
But it's really looking at how do we solve the core root of the issue. There's a very famous sort of term by Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, one of the very famous social entrepreneurship organizations around the world. He says it's not enough to teach a person, it's not enough to give a person a fish, or it's not even enough to teach a person to fish. You should not stop until you revolutionize the whole fishing industry. That's really for a social entrepreneur what they're looking at.
Beautiful.
That wider systemic change, not only from the top up, but also from the bottom up. Not only in terms of the grassroots solution, but also the policies in the wider environment. Not only looking at having a very cool innovation that you want to maybe scale and sell off and sort of go to market,
like a gimmick,
but really to go to the core of sort of the values and having that being put into action, and making sure that the social issue that you're intending to set out to solve is done so in a way you can eventually step back on. That's also with the acknowledgement, and I think this is important to add. No one social issue can be solved alone. There is no one heropreneur. There isn't this magical single person or one single organization which is going to solve climate change. And it's also there with the acknowledgement that you're working in a wider ecosystem, that it's important to collaborate, that you're all part of the solution, but also that it doesn't work to then be competitive in many cases with each other. When you're sort of solving social issues. And I think those are some of the structural and maybe legal sort of forms that maybe differ sort of social enterprises from enterprises, but also the more philosophical approaches in compared to sort of your regular enterprises.
So you mentioned earlier kind of bridging the gender gap in the workplace, especially in top management, company boards and all that. So let me pose this. One, what is the importance of having women in these positions? Like why does it matter?
Yeah.
Number one. And number two, kind of in line with that, I mean, I think what's also happened in some respects is that, especially with women, we kind of expect them to play two roles, right? We expect them to, and when I say we, I mean, there is that kind of natural dimension to it where, you know, the woman kind of bears the child and kind of has that unique capacity, right? And so I guess the question that I'm posing here is, in some respects, what that's doing, one may pose, is that it's creating an expectation of women to both hold the fort at home with the family, but also to kind of venture and go out there. So one, what is the benefit of that? And two, how do we kind of reconcile that with kind of the woman's unique ability to kind of bear children and all that?
As men, we don't deserve women's forgiveness, I think, for what we've done, because the amount of, you know, we talk about sort of childbearing and also the work that's done at home. All of that is labor. All of that is work. All of that is work which we don't value because we don't value in our economies. We don't also, in many cases, unfortunately, as I see, people don't also value it on an interpersonal level, don't see the amount of work and effort and how difficult it is to hold that. The work that is required for the world to keep running is overwhelmingly being done by women. And there, I think, one, we need to have that shift in terms of what we value. And what our values are when you look at you know, when we say sort of work or not work, you know, a woman raising a child, there's nothing more beautiful, of course, but it's an immense amount of work. It's work that should also not just be done by the woman. Often that labor is being left to her, and it is something that also developed over time. The patriarchy did not always exist. You know, you go sort of 2,000 plus years ago, and you can see that this is also something that developed over time. It's not something that was natural to human beings always. This is not something that I think we need to accept as natural or something that is part of life. It is something we have designed, and it's something we should undesign ourselves out of, and what the feminist movements are also working towards.
It's funny as you say this, like, you know, sometimes we say that, oh, you know, this idea of wanting women or whatever not to work or be at home all the time is kind of like a backwards idea. But then if you go to like some, you know, if you look at some rural areas, you see that, man, like in the fields, there is no male, female. Everyone's in the field, right? Yeah. In fact, sometimes even more women than men, because, you know, maybe women want to stay closer to home. The home is there, the field is there, so they can kind of, you know, balance that aspect of their lives, and the men kind of go venture out and maybe sell on the market, or unnecessarily even the women go and sell on the market. But I think it's interesting that you say that this is not something that has always been there. We shouldn't just accept that this is kind of how things are. Rather, there is that one, value what the woman does in terms of, well, one, labor and kind of her unique abilities in that respect of bearing child and what follows, but also that there is space for more. So sorry, I interrupted, but that it provoked that thought in me.
No, absolutely. I mean, even on we talk about spiritual dimensions in our many traditions. There's a belief that gender, in the heavens is something that doesn't exist. There isn't that binary. It is universal when you talk about the heavenly spheres. And we talk about sort of tasawwuf and how that acknowledgement as well, and bringing also those teachings there on earth as well, that deep value, and not based on gender, but based on the sacredness of what it means to be a human being, and valuing that in and of itself, even if a woman doesn't choose to bear a child. That does not make it any less valuable in the labor and the efforts and what she's contributing to society.
Beautiful.
It's not dependent on that. And you speak to even the boardroom or leadership and why that diversity is needed. And it's not even just about women. It's the same for men, although we seem to have accepted it for men. But our leaderships, our boards, the way that we run our organizations and who's in it needs to be a reflection of society. For it to be effective organizations, for them to be organizations that really are responsive to the needs of human beings. If we're really building organizations and systems which are inclusive in a way that builds, we talked about this wider wealth for all of humanity. And, if we are really saying that this is the world that is needed, it wouldn't even be a question to say we need men's diversity or women's diversity. I think that's a given, and it's also important that it's also diversity even within that. It's not enough just to stop at men and women. It's also important that there's diversity amongst, of course, like races, faiths, ethnic beliefs, ethnic backgrounds, and depending also on the context that you're in whatever city that you're in or town that you're in, a community in, that what you need to be that reflection of what society is. And we are overwhelmingly building our systems in a way which is not reflective of that. And we see that constantly being mentioned as an issue in the tech industry, in places like Silicon Valley and others, where it shows up in the way that code is done because women are not involved in the coding. It shows up in the way that climate solutions are actually created. A large criticism of many different climate movements is that in not bringing a gendered perspective into it, they actually are discounting the number one sort of stakeholder and person who's going to be the most affected by climate change, which is women, because they're already at a disadvantage. They're already at a disadvantage economically and politically in terms of many laws around in different countries, and issues like climate change, issues like COVID as well, only accelerate and exacerbate sort of these inequalities. There's organizations in Bahrain, as there are around the world, dealing with a huge influx of gender violence because of COVID, because suddenly women are stuck at home in these abusive partnerships and relationships or family environments, and with very few avenues to escape. And it's something that just assaults us every day. It's something that it's where looking at a more systemic view is important, because in dealing with issues like the structural inequalities of climate change, you need to look at it from these gendered lenses. In looking at how we diversify our economies, yes, it's looking at inequality across the spectrum. And how do we build these solutions that have that lens in mind, rather than sort of a more one-dimensional approach that we're building solutions from the perspective of Arab men from the ages of 40 to 60. And what that means is a reflection of our societies. No offense to Arab men in the ages of 40 to 60. I love you all, and I wish for all of us to be free from our own patriarchy. But yeah, it's important also from those dimensions.
It's interesting you mentioned like COVID, and I think there was an article I read a few weeks ago that countries with more female leaders have actually been more successful in fighting COVID. And I think to myself, reflecting, like, why would that be? If you think of a mother, right? And like, there's always these images like, and when I say mother, I mean across all species, or at least like, let's say the animal world, for example, which, in some respects we're a part of. And you see that there's always that image of like, the mother hen will always protect her chicks no matter what. She gets like, she'll be like a fearful chicken, but then when it comes to her chicks, like she'll like defend them, and other animals with the same. Or as humans, like you think that the mother's like that protective mother of her children, and it's that sense of empathy and mercy and compassion that kind of I think the female also brings, whether it's in the boardroom or whether it's in kind of leading communities and societies and countries, where it's like, what, we don't care about your money now. We need to protect our people, and let's take quick, bold action, protect, let's keep us safe, and then we'll go back to kind of dealing with whatever we need to deal with, economies and all that. So I just found that that article kind of interesting in that respect.
I'm going to maybe bring here also maybe a bit of a philosophical and spiritual dimension to it. yes, and the mother is also something that is not just gendered. We go back to Tasawwuf traditions. The mother is also within us, even as men. Those qualities that you mentioned are not foreign to us. We are called also to be the mother and the father within. We're both called in that divine masculine and that sacred feminine, to refine that unity within us. That when we talk about these values, when you talk about these akhlaq, it is not something that is relegated to just women. And I think as men, we need to allow ourselves to fully step into also our motherhood, and as a strange way as it may sound, to be able to really step into that nurturing, which I also think is the ultimate form of fatherhood. And I mean that not in the literal sense of being a father, but also what that archetype means of being nurturing, of being compassionate, is I think something we all can step into. I think is that mother is within all of us. And you bring that point up of also in other species, and I think this is also where when we talk about diversity, it's also in our work, also diversity of species and bringing those perspectives in. And the beautiful values that you talked about they're older than humanity itself. Empathy, compassion, these are things which have existed far longer than human beings. These are tenets of not just only human beings, but of so much of nature, so much of how the world is created and has been built, and how it lives and it operates, shows up in different forms of altruism in species, whether it's in ants or bees or otherwise, how elephants display compassion, how dolphins display compassion, how they also grieve, how they're also enjoy. All these things that we think are elements that we should hold on to as human beings, and that also as human beings we sometimes maybe put as more sort of female characteristics, are available to us all. And I think we are invited in each moment to step into our higher wisdom, into these values.
Connecting to the Tasawwuf tradition, you say that these ideas or these values or these realities, compassion, mercy, they come from before humanity.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if we can connect to that tradition, they exist in eternity.
Yes.
And in fact, the world that came from that eternity reflects those values because it came from that to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the unity between the world and the world that it came from, which held those values in essence. So, Tariq, we've talked a lot about in this conversation Tasawwuf. I'm more interested, especially, for those that are listening / watching. Tariq has an interesting Instagram account, so you guys can follow him. But when I look through your account, you have several trips to like Turkey and participating in Sufi kind of sessions. I'm not sure what to call them. How did you get, so it seems to me like this is something that kind of was within your household, or how did you get connected to it? How did you get more involved in it? How did it kind of become in some respects you, or you became it? I don't know how you describe that, but how did you get more involved in that?
I think like many beautiful things in life, you can't pinpoint the beginning. I think like many beautiful things in life, it finds you rather than you finding it or you seeking it. I'd say this in not only just with the Tasawwuf tradition, but also in what that means for many mystic traditions. As I'm a lover of faith, a lover of studying faith, lover of understanding the inner dimensions of that and the many mystic traditions. The one that obviously comes closest to us in sort of our more immediate tradition, Islam obviously is Tasawwuf, but there's the Jewish tradition has their mystic dimensions, as does the Christians, the Buddhists, the Hindus, and I think it's beautiful and has been a beautiful journey to learn. I think from across the board, and for me it was. I think a twinning between, and I've spoken about this in other places, around the grief that can sometimes be felt in doing this work, when you're constantly, every single day, being faced with the devastation and destruction of the world in some form or another, is difficult to handle. And it's not that you're being negative, but you're very aware, sort of day on day, between the destruction in this part of the world and this part of the world and this part of the world and this species loss and this ecosystem loss. And that's something that's heartbreaking. And one aspect of what maybe drew me closer to those traditions is that it is traditions first and foremost that say you need to make peace with the universe, and also find joy with it.
What does it mean to make peace with the universe?
It is to be able to step into the brokenness, the pain of it, the suffering of it, to still see amongst all these things that assault us, a unity behind the destruction, to be able to step into that, for it to still, as Maulana Rumi says, for it to break open your heart time and time and time again, so that the heart may be more refined and the heart may be more joyful. It is a tradition that, yes, it steps into the suffering of life and doesn't discount it, but it's also one that steps into the ecstasy and the joy and the wonder and the awe that life has to hold. And it helped me to make sense not just of what was happening in the outer world, but also in what my response was in my inner world. It was a way for me to not just step into finding solutions, as much as that's important, but also be able to have peace and being detached from the world as well. We're in the world and not from it, and we can work towards solution after solution after solution, but also there's holding that and the importance of dealing with climate change, of dealing with COVID, yes, and at the same time, the sun will eventually destroy the earth in billions and billions of years and destroy everything that we know and all of our collective memories. And there's a need to also just let go and have peace with that. And I think I found communities that stepped into that were ones that I found deep resonance with and learning. But it also was traditions of love, of walking a path of love and trying to, as we sort of spoke before about the values that we hope to cultivate, they're beautiful classrooms to cultivate these values. They're beautiful mirrors as well, to find all the places that your actions do not absolutely meet those values whatsoever, and find a compassionate space to enter into. So, yeah.
When you mention love, what do you mean by love? Because I think people have a lot of kind of mixed notions of it in some respects.
Can this be another podcast?
Well, I mean,
because when you ask me that kind of question, he's like looking at his watch. I mean, when you ask me that,
because you said it's another podcast, I'm like, okay, what are we doing on time? But okay, let's kind of come.
I mean, when you ask me that question, I'm thinking, geez, I mean,
can I have another half an hour?
Well, it's like, Tariq, can you speak to infinity? Tariq, can you speak to everything in existence and the inner dimensions of everything in existence?
So you're already answering the question, so go ahead.
I mean, but it's like, Tariq, can you speak to everything that is both seen and unseen and everything that is woven into the fabric of the universe? It is, I think, beyond words, and I'll leave that to, I think, the mystics who've either, I would say, spoken to it more eloquently, although I think what's more correct is their silence has spoken greater in what loves mean in the way that humans can, I think, understand or maybe scratch a surface of what that truth could be.
I mean, okay, so you mentioned infinity. I mean, and then so take me a little closer. Like, let me at least feel the heat. Love. I mean, I think.
If you want to feel the heat, put your hand on your heart.
Okay, beautiful. طارق, as we go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it's also the love, and I'll connect this to everything that we've kind of spoken to about that path of the mystics of radical love, that path of walking love, and in those sort of definitions, it's also to become closer to the beloved, to become closer to the divine. That is one aspect of it. And I think for those who are maybe not God-centered in their lives, that also just means acknowledging the divinity as well that is in all, that is in everything, and treating life as such, treating life as sacred, and even taking that approach and asking the question, how can I be more loving today? How can I be more loving today in the family that I'm in? How can I be more loving today to my colleagues? How can I be more loving today in the products and services that we're creating? Even that simple shift to love and what that can mean in a way that is healthy, and there's boundaries and all those caveats.
But it's a very pragmatic love. The love that you spoke about earlier spoke to infinity.
And sometimes you need to be able to find a way to live infinity as well. We are of the ethereal, but we're also of the earth. We're also of the mundane. We've also been put on this earth. We also participate in the system. And I think I often see this disconnect actually sometimes in sort of faith communities or mystic communities, where there is a deep sense of working towards spiritual liberation, but maybe not a commitment to social justice, and vice versa, where there's maybe a deep commitment to social justice and not a commitment to spiritual liberation, and how our work is also both. This is our time on earth is also a place to practice these values. It is the lesson that we're living. It is our human curriculum, and I think it's beautiful to step into the infinity of it. And I also believe that we can show up in very small and micro ways, both outwardly and also an inward journey of trying to put that into practice somehow.
I was going to ask you, what does a new earth look like? But I think in some respects you answer that by saying a sense of spiritual liberation and social justice and spiritual liberation. Is that what a new earth looks like?
I would say yes, and to add upon that, the new earth exists. The new earth is this parallel world which lives alongside us. It is everything that is perhaps not human. It is the world of the oceans and the forests and all the species within it. It is the world of the desert ecosystems. It's the world of the 7 to 8 million other species who live in this world, which is regenerative. It is living in a world which is creating conditions conducive to life. It is living in the world which is more often than not collaborative, that whether intentional or not, holds the principle of the sacredness of life true. And that's not to romanticize nature, because there's also a lot of destruction in that world as well. But it's also a world that has been working for many billions of years. And we are called in our version of the earth of humanity that we've created to participate in that system of the earth that belongs to all other species as well. And for that separation no longer to be there.
Beautiful. Tariq, I'm tempted to ask you one more question before we end.
Is it a question about the Terminator?
No, maybe. I was going to say, when you talk about the lover and the beloved, I see a lover and a beloved. But then we also talk about unity. How do you reconcile those two ideas? Is it one, or is it a lover and a beloved two?
there's a, God rest his soul, Pir Velayat, incredible Sufi master, would say that Sufism is the reconciliation of their irreconcilables. That it is a tradition that says there is a lover and the beloved. That in Hadith al-Qudsi there is the famous saying that and the beloved is saying, I was a hidden treasure, so I wanted to be known. And there is that inference that there is a distance as well that's needed to be a mirror to the beloved in that. But then there's also the truth as well that comes into, we cannot enter into the domain of the divine or the beloved if it's about bringing the I into that domain, that we must leave the I, that we must leave the ego to be able to enter into that ocean of oneness. And there's these two teachings that are there, and they both exist together and simultaneously and beautifully, and as I think as most of the universe in a beautiful united paradox that enables us to enter maybe into what that looks like here on this earth, and perhaps on whatever dimension there is beyond.
It's as if you're saying there's like plenty in one and one in plenty, or many in one and one in many, in some respects.
Could be so.
Beautiful. Tariq, we're coming to a close, even though a part of me doesn't want to. I think I have 10 more questions, and then from that maybe another 10, and then, well, we need to come to a close. I think I'd like to ask you, how can we end with maybe a few verses of maybe poetry or something that you like from Rumi or any of the Sufi masters that you kind of have learned from?
So what I'd like to share, we spoke about Maulana Rumi quite a few times, so I'll end with that and a prayer that is being shared within that tradition, and a mantra being shared within that tradition, just as a reminder for this moment and all that people are going through. This too shall pass. The dark night of the soul shall pass. Trials and tribulations will pass. A dawn will arise, and that dawn too will pass. What we are called to do through it all is to love and protect one another. And my prayer for all those who are listening is that you may be loved and that you may be protected and that you may share that same love on those around you.
Tariq, thank you very much for sharing that and sharing this conversation with us. I think as I come to a close, what really stands out to me is that you shared both pain and love with us. And I think I connect that to what you said about paradoxes and reconciling the irreconcilables. That was a mouthful. So yes, perhaps that is what it is. It's exactly what this conversation was about. It was about the pain and the love and the pain. So thank you very much, Tariq.
No, thank you for hosting this space, and for me and for many others, and for your deep wisdom and questioning, and really holding it with such compassion and love and care in and of itself. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tariq. Thank you.
Thank you.